Today's podcast is with Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. Is that okay? Is that how?
Yeah, it's great.
Adequate rendition of your name.
That's great. Thank you.
Good.
You got my first name correct. Bang on. Ranganathan, that's good.
Oh,
Any version of
Ranganathan,
Ranganathan will
Oh,
do.
God.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me off the hook there. Anyways, we're here today to talk particularly about his new book, The Anti-Colonial Reader. Or is that right? Anti-Colonial Yoga Reader?
Anti-colonial philosophy
Okay.
and action-focused guide to practice.
I knew there was some reason why I hadn't got it exactly right. Anyways, it's a bit of a tongue twister, but it's an excellent book. I recommend it for everyone, so please get it. It's not expensive. You can get it on Amazon. I read it in a number of sittings. Just can't say how good it is. But on the other hand, it is challenging. It is somewhat complicated. I think it's inspiring as well, though. So today we're going to just try and unpick a few of those ideas, and I'm going to, basically try and pick Dr. Ranganathan's brains about some of these, particularly the idea of, there's a couple of buzzwords that you use there a number of times. And the first one we're going to try and will explain to me is the idea of this LAT, which is Linguistic Account of Thought. And I think that's a good place to base it on, right? Because this is where the trouble starts, it seems, with colonialism.
Right. So if you look at the history of the Western tradition, it goes back to this idea that thought is what you say. So it confuses thinking with our culture. And what we can say in our language is really a result of the history of our culture. And so if we are restricting what we're allowing ourselves to contemplate to what is culturally familiar, that causes two kinds of problems. The first problem is that we will filter anything that is culturally foreign to us. So if we live in a westernized world, and all of us do everywhere, if we try and learn yoga, then we're going to filter it through our cultural expectations of the Western tradition. So that's one big problem. But historically, how this is played out is that people who think that understanding is about what's familiar in their culture think that understanding others is about making sense of them in terms of their culture. And so this is how colonialism rolls out. It turns into an imposition of cultural expectations on others as a way for them to be accommodated. So, I'm Canadian, and it only ended recently, this atrocious history of residential schools where Indigenous kids were kidnapped, and by churches. Well, the government kidnapped them, but it was run by churches, and the idea was that they had to be made into some kind of English or French-speaking person and a Christian. And you would only get that sense that you would need to do that if you thought that to be able to communicate with these people, they had to somehow be brought into your cultural sphere, right? So it's a very violent, on the one hand, it's just, you can look at it and go, that's really stupid. Why should I think that understanding is restricted to what's culturally familiar to me? Like, that's a pretty silly idea to begin with, because we can think about all the ways in which my culture is a result of its history, and that what that leads out is all sorts of different histories right? So just thinking about it, you think it's a ridiculous idea. But then it's also violent. There's this history of violence. And so I think that when people come to yoga, they come to it in a westernized world with these expectations that yoga should be intelligible relative to these cultural expectations we have. And because we live in a world that's been overwhelmingly colonized by the Western tradition, we want it to be at the very least friendly to that tradition, right? And the idea that, it could teach us something that's subversive and disruptive to colonialism and oppression gets filtered out by this very method. But if we can drop that, and if we can just do what I think researchers do, and what the yoga tradition tells us to do from the start. Don't think about understanding in terms of your experiences, but think about it as this yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, where you're organizing and being responsible for what you're contemplating, and then tada drishta swarupya avasthan, then you are in a position to understand, right? So this is really learning is an engaged event. It's not just this passive thing where we're filtering through our expectations. So, so that's just generally true. But I think when people come from traditions with this linguistic account of thought in the background, they're especially hobbled because they've gotten used to thinking that understanding is about cultural familiarity.
And is that the same to this thing that I have to say I'm still struggling with? And I wanted to get to talk to you personally, the difference between the understanding and the belief. So if I say, and
right.
you use it, So just explain it to me again, because I really struggle with this one.
Sure. So it's not something that's clearly distinguished in a westernized world, thinking and believing, but there's an important difference. So right now it's pouring outside where I am in Toronto. So I could consider the thought it is raining outside. And whether it could be, let's say it's sunny outside, I could consider that thought, and then I could draw an inference from the thought it's raining outside. Say, well, if it's true that it's raining outside, then water is falling from the sky. So I can use some logic. But if I'm talking about my belief, a belief is what they call a proposition. This is the English term. It would be a vritti. But a propositional attitude where you have an attitude that the thought is true. So I could believe that it's raining outside, but then I've changed the topic from the thought to how I feel about it. And if I confuse thinking and believing, I've changed what I could be. I could be responsible about. So when I'm reasoning, I'm doing yoga citta vritti nirodha. I'm organizing my thinking, drawing it to a conclusion. But if I confuse what I can contemplate with my psychology, how I feel about a thought, then I'm really making it about me. And so I use the 2020 U.S. presidential election as an example. So, the poll workers, they did the yoga citta vritti nirodha. There was a bunch of data and they organized it to a conclusion. And they discovered that Biden had won that election. And then there were Trumpies who had a belief that Trump won the election. So everybody could contemplate the thought Trump won the election, but if you engaged in the data processing, you'd go, it's not true. He didn't win. But if you have the belief that he won and you're using that as the basis of your explanation, you're not going to be able to deal with the data. So anything that conflicts with that belief will become problematic. You make up all sorts of stories about persecution and malfeasance to explain the disparity between your belief and what happens. And then you lose your autonomy, because what happens then is you're being governed by that belief. And that's what happened in the insurrection. These people lost themselves because they were driven by their beliefs. This is what the Yoga Sutra is talking about when it says that we have this basic choice between, being a function of what we're contemplating or being responsible and autonomous for organizing what we can contemplate.
I suppose there's two things that come from this. One, is it possible to not interpolate one's own thoughts on interpreting another culture, right? So, you also talk about this Western appropriated culture. Is it possible to get out of one's own interpretive box to look at another? I mean, how would that look? Right,
So
that's one, and the second one is these two, and you can run with it now. And the second one is in terms of understanding and a belief. Well, pure understanding up here doesn't mean anything until you say, well, I believe in that, and then act on it. And you always talk about sovereignty in the book and autonomy.
Yeah,
there must be some relation between understanding and belief. Otherwise, we're just philosophers sitting around contemplating our navel all day and not kind of determining on any course of action. So belief and understanding, can they, don't they always go together? Aren't they important to go together?
Yeah.
There's two questions. Yeah.
Great. So let's start with the second. So no, it's not important because action is about choice. It's not about belief. So belief is just a path. So this kind of story of philosophy as a passive thing is really something that we generate if we think it's about our beliefs, because believing is actually a very passive state of existence. It's about giving an emotional endorsement to something. Acting is a choice. So when we can first organize the options, then we're in a position to choose, right? The problem is when we're driven by belief, we can't understand options because we can only tolerate what we believe. So we're actually depriving ourselves the capacity to make choices, which is why people who are driven by belief lose their autonomy. They become part of a mob and a herd, and they don't act in ways that respect themselves and other people. And sorry, the first question was,
is it possible to look to
Yes.
look in any other way apart from the outside in, interpreting
Sure.
one's own culture,
Right.
another culture through the lens of one's own historical culture.
Yeah. So we just choose a different method. So if we think that, so this is why I mean, I've learned a lot from the Yoga Sutra, because what it says, what it begins with is this choice between methods that we could adopt. Just like the 2020 US presidential election presented people. You could adopt just the logic-based processing of data. It doesn't mean that you don't have beliefs about who should win and, but it's just that doesn't determine the conclusion. Rather, it's just like, I can tally votes, whatever my belief, and then I come to conclude, and maybe I'm surprised, right? Or I'd adopt another method where it's about how I look at the world, and then I can't tolerate anything that doesn't fit in it. So I think it's not, so this idea that somehow there's something especially problematic about understanding something from another culture, I don't think is true. It's just, even in everyday circumstances, we are challenged to choose between these two methods. Now, I think for some people who have just gotten used to using their beliefs on the basis of their culture because their universe is set up that way, right? Like there's a certain kind of, it's a new skill. But I think that's just what we teach in philosophy. That's just intro to philosophy. You learn logic, you learn arguments, you learn to understand arguments based on propositions you don't agree with. It doesn't matter. And I think the more interesting point is that we need logic because a lot of times we don't even know what's true. Right? So when we're engaging in research, our beliefs aren't even important because we don't even know what to believe, right? It's only after we've sorted the data that we're in a position to make some type of educated guess about what's going on. And so if we, the pandemic is another example, right? New illness. Some people are like, oh, it's a flu. It's a cold. So these people were just interpreting. They were just using their prior beliefs developed in the world they experienced. And then there are other people who just looked at the data and then followed to the conclusion that they want to know what's the best explanation of this new disease. And the problem is that the flu and the cold explanation didn't explain all the new symptoms, right? So, but you wouldn't notice that if you were insistent upon interpreting. So I think the challenge of just learning yoga isn't really any different from the challenge of learning anything. It's just that if we've been privileged and gotten used to not learning, right, it's a new skill that we have to develop. But it's not impossible. People do it all the time, right? And I think, that's kind of the neat thing about yoga. It's just so ordinary. This challenge to be responsible as a learner is just a very ordinary thing we have to do all the time.
Yeah. Excellent. And I think this goes on with your ideas about the kind of the prioritization of a secular culture, and the Western culture is a secular culture, and all that other stuff is religion, right? Is dogma,
Yeah.
right? And secularism is rational, correct, and all that Indian stuff and that foreign stuff is all about dogma and religion, and
Right.
we're going to study it in terms of words, like, and I hear this often now with yoga scholars. We're philologists, we're the studies of language. We're going to tell you the roots of dharma, or the
Right.
the Maudya Williams dictionary says about this particular Sanskrit word, rather than looking. And you make the excellent point, I think, of looking at dharma and say, well, this is a debate. It's not to be studied philologically about what the language says. It's it's a debate, and it's valid philosophy. And I mentioned before we chatted about my undergraduate with philosophy, and told Shyam that when I asked her when the Indian philosophy was happening in my degree, they said it's not. That's the religious department, and I think that's just been a really unfortunate and an embarrassing oversight over these years, that the whole of the Indian philosophy, which if you look at the stuff as well, like South Asian Nagarjuna, incredibly applied rational logic, has just been dismissed as religion. So please just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I draw a distinction between two different pictures of secularism. So there's the white supremacy version, which is like anything said. So we use the word West too widely. There's a specific tradition going back to the ancient Greeks, and I call that the capital W that leans on the East. Call that the West. That's a colonizing tradition. And that the ancient Greeks had this linguistic account of thought, so it all starts from there. And what this tradition does or did as it evolved is that it created the concept, the category of religion as a colonial category to deal with traditions that it was swallowing, but not completely destroying. So early Jews were counted as having religion, but the early Christians weren't, because Christianity was a threat to the Roman Empire because the Romans killed Jesus, right? So certain changes had to be made to Christian doctrine in order to make it more friendly to colonialism. Then it became the official religion. Then Muhammad decides to make a religion, right, on the basis of like this earlier template from Constantine. So by the time people who have this intellectual basis in the Western tradition come to South Asia, they bring with them what I call secularism too, which is the idea that the secular is the Western and everything else outside that you're going to swallow but not completely destroys religion. And the point of religion is to find a way to subjugate, to treat the Western as kind of the default platform for everybody, and then what's colonized as a kind of local thing. And so Middle Easterners called South Asians Hindus because the word Hindu is cognated with Sindhu. We get our word India from the same root. And then when the British came, they're like, you have a religion called Hinduism. So they continued this ancient Roman practice. But what I point out in my work and in the earlier book that I know that you're familiar with is that what the British decided to call Hinduism was just philosophy. There was no common view. Everybody was disagreeing. So I call that secularism 1, which is just free thinking. So I think we should be secular, but I think we should get rid of the white supremacy and just be free thinking. We should just learn philosophical controversies. We should use our yogic logical skills to understand the options. But, you know, people, even though people know the history, it's not like I'm the first person to kind of point this out. I learned about this from others, right? So, but what, even though people know, they're not willing to kind of take the extra step to go, hey, this is just white supremacy. Like, this is just so obviously white supremacy, right? Because as I pointed, the same position said by a brown person 2,000 years ago in Sanskrit is Hinduism. If you have, so for instance, Sankhya, the Sankhya Karika, Ishvara Krishna says the universe is the evolution of matter. Mind, intellect, these are just emergent properties. They're complex states of matter, right? And there's no God. It's just all the evolution of matter. That's Hinduism. If it's said by a white dude in Europe, that would be something else, secular rationalism or something like that. I mean, it's just so blatantly racist that, and people know, there's like, it's not like this is hidden. It's like, scholars, all South Asians know this stuff, but because this is just an example of how colonialism becomes this, and why we have to look to yoga to really help us understand this, is that it becomes an internalized political agenda, our personal asmita. We've internalized the politics of the world, and then instead of acting autonomously in interest, as people who have an interest in devotion to Ishvara, sovereignty, we act as agents of the oppressive politics of our world. So then people perpetuate this white supremacist nonsense. You know, people should be terribly embarrassed about this, but, you know, so this is just the foundations of yoga studies. It happens not in philosophy, outside philosophy, religious studies, philology, you know, by people who are neither interested nor trained in philosophy, right? It's just pure white supremacy. It's nuts, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, and you make the valid point that it's not just, now it's not just white people. It's simply societies, let's say Western culture, or Western philosophical underpinned culture, right? I mean, if you're looking at Hinduism, we know the Brahma and the Arya Samaj were the Indian people making Hinduism from within, as it were. So it's, you know, that's a westernization, right? Of
right. That's what colonialism does.
Yeah,
it localizes the oppression as part of the local self-understanding. Right.
Yeah. Look, what about the four? I really liked the ways to view yoga. I was Aristotelian way of view and the Platonic view, and there was two other ways to view yoga, wasn't there? Which is excellent, like the pyramid, and then there was the cultural way. Yeah, speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the chapters, Western Samskaras, a samskara. So let me just back up and say a little bit about what yoga is, and then I'll kind of unpack. So
Okay.
yoga, the basic idea of yoga is that, we have this basic choice where we can either understand in terms of our experiences or beliefs, or we take this organizational approach to the information, learn new conclusions. And that's what we would call the meta ethics. It's kind of a very abstract level of choice. And then the normative ethics of yoga is this practice of devotion to Ishvara, which is this abstract ideal of right choosing and doing, sovereignty. And then it's composed of two kinds of properties. Book 1, Sutra 24 potentially lays it out. So it's free from its past and also free to move forward. And so then when we look at the start of Book 2 of the Yoga Sutra, potentially says that yoga as a kriya, as an activity, is devotion to Ishvara, and then we practice these two essential states. And tapas is this freedom from the past, so I call that unconservatism. And then it's also a freedom to move into the future, so you self-determine, you self-govern, you choose your own values. So when we're actually practicing yoga, that's what we're doing. So any kind of trick or skill that you could be perfecting, whether it's prana breathing or some kind of posture, is yoga insofar as it's a way to explore these basic commitments to sovereignty and then self-challenge, self-determination. But what happens in a westernized world, because this gets filtered out, this devotion to sovereignty is not a basic ethical theory in the Western tradition, even though it's a basic ethical theory. And so Westerners, when they come to it, they want to filter yoga through familiar political institutions. Now, why do they want to do this? Because when we're not practicing yoga, we're internalizing our experiences of the world we live in. And then we set up these samskaras, these habits of kind of imposing judgments and expectations on things. And there are at least three ways in which Westerners who are not learning yoga, but rather trying to filter yoga through their Western samskaras, go about this. And I call this Western appropriated culture whack, where what people are doing is they're taking South Asian words and ideas, but then they're just reconstituting Western political institutions. So the first is the Plato's Republic idea. So this is not yoga, but this is what people think is yoga. There's an enlightened guru at the top, and then there's a pyramid, and then the enlightened guru dispenses the curriculum, and then everybody tries to fit into this pyramid by showing that they've mastered it, and then they're trying to get up, right? So that's a very common model in the
we
yoga
all know about
world.
that one. Yeah,
For sure. And of course, right, often people are surprised when the guy at the top is a creep and has all these other problems. And then they get upset about yoga. They think, that's not yoga. That's Plato,
yoga's fake.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. Then there's the Aristotelian model. So Aristotle thought that ethical learning was really a process of enculturalization. You have to be raised properly. And so this shows up in the idea that you have to go native. So this is when people try and be as South Asian as they can. They go to India and they say namaste even when it's not appropriate. All this kind of nutty stuff where they're trying to perform their South Asianness, right, as though that's yoga knowledge. But, that's Aristotle. That's not, learning isn't about cultural mastery or anything like that in yoga. And the other way in which this Western whack shows up is in this Stoicism, right? So the Stoics thought that, everything is fine. It's just how you feel. Like, the problem is your attitude, right? So yoga then is reconverted as a way to deal with our own anxiety or our emotional dysfunction, and not as an activity of political engagement, because we can't change the world. It's fine. The problem is just you. So these are three ways that I see yoga is not, people aren't learning yoga. They're just recreating Western political institutions while using the word yoga and saying namaste and stuff like that.
I liked that because it was an easy way into a more complicated subjects, really, which you went ahead anyway. So we're going to backtrack now on that again, because I did it on purpose, in fact, because
Okay.
this idea
Oh,
of the
sorry.
right.
Okay.
No, it's all right, it's all right. But I always got a nice little soundbite because we all know the pyramid scheme and the guru, and then the
Yeah.
getting into the culture, and then the stoicism thing, which really annoys me actually. That yoga is really confused with stoicism now,
Yeah.
isn't it? It's just super
Yeah.
popular, and everyone's showing a Marcus Aurelius book, and
Oh my
kind of
God.
kind of frustrating.
It drives me nuts. And Marcus Aurelius was an emperor who had an interest in everybody just not complaining, right? And so he says, there's no problem. Take away the complaint, and you've taken away the problem. It's amazing, right? The only problem is that you are complaining, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's offensive and ridiculous. Both. But
That
it's
is
really
good.
weird
Yeah,
that people think that it has
so
anything
popular.
to do with
I
yoga.
know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to go to is a slightly more from there, the slightly more complicated ideas of your ways of seeing the world. So you have I think there's four ways of seeing the world, right? And this is more complicated. The right, and then there's the good, the virtue
Oh,
ethics.
I see. The
Right,
four
that
basic
one,
ethical theories.
that one, and
Right.
because it goes into yoga and the idea of
Sure,
sovereignty
yeah.
that you were talking about, sovereignty and Ishvara,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
so this is fundamental. This is kind of the core of I think Shyam's message, Dr. Shyam's message in the book is this one, which is very complicated. I find it anyway.
So my work in all of this began when I was interested in another racist story, which is that South Asian philosophers weren't interested in moral and political questions, which is a story you will want to tell about people you want to colonize. And this was just everybody believes this. When I published my first book, Ethics in the History of Indian Philosophy, based on my MA thesis, it was the first book on the topic in decades. People just were like convinced. And then when I edited a book on Indian ethics, I got submissions from people saying ethics isn't an important part of the Indian tradition. Even for a collected volume on Indian ethics, people are saying that kind of stuff. I'm the only guy who's been working on Indian moral philosophy, the whole tradition. There are people who work on like specific contributions, this person, that person, but I've been kind of, and this is not, I don't say this with pride. I think it's ridiculous that I'm the only guy who's made this a point of research. So one of the things that I learned from yoga was that when we can appreciate that we have a choice with respect to how we deal with information, right? This is a basic question of research. Do I just understand everything in terms of my beliefs, my attitudes, my emotions, or do I take this responsible yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, where I'm organizing things to conclusion and then I'm allowing myself to assess where that takes us? If we look at questions of dharma, right, these two methodologies take us in different directions. If I interpret, I'm going to correlate the word dharma with every belief I have about the world, and then all of a sudden dharma has like a million meanings. That's the normal view in the literature. No one meaning, lots of meanings. It doesn't make any sense. If we explicate, what we would do is we would use logic to derive from a perspective, a theory that would then logically entail what that perspective has to say about dharma. And then we would understand the concept as what these theories are disagreeing about, which gets us to the debate, right? So if we can get over our own narcissism and just look at the data as researchers do with logic, we would see that what they were disagreeing about was the right choice or good outcome. That's the basic topic of moral philosophy. So if we're concerned about right choice and good outcome, there's actually four basic ethical theories, and we only have three in the Western tradition. So the first one I list is virtue ethics, which says you have to be a good person in order to know what to do. And if you're not a good person, you got to go find one to tell you what to do. And theism is a version of virtue ethics. God is the ultimately good agent who will tell us what to do. Then there's consequentialism that says, well, you have to know what the good is, say happiness or reduction of suffering, and then that justifies some course of action. So Buddhists are consequentialists, classical Buddhists, right? The suffering's a bad thing, you got to reduce it. So then whatever gets you to that end is dharma, is the right thing to do. Then you have deontology, which is the flip, is the inverse of consequentialism. So there's lots of good things to do, but some you have special reason to do. And so Bhagavad Gita, Karma Yoga, is a classic version of deontology. Krishna says, well, better your dharma poorly performed than someone else as well, right? There are lots of things for us to do, but there's something that you have a special obligation to master, right? And he has a story about what that amounts to. We have those three ethical theories in the Western tradition. They are the only basic three ethical theories in the Western tradition, but there's room for a fourth, which is the mirror opposite of virtue ethics. So virtue ethics says you have to be good in order to know what to do, to the right thing to do. Yoga is the opposite. Yoga / bhakti. You start with the right, which is to be devoted to the ideal of the right, Ishvara. And then as you perfect this devotional practice, you bring about the good, which is your own independence, your own autonomy. So yoga / bhakti is a basic ethical theory. It's not surprising. It's not in the Western tradition because the Western tradition is a colonizing tradition. And devotion to Ishvara is decolonial because you're devoted to sovereignty and you're working on your own independence. So it's not really easy to be colonized if that's your priority. You would rather be resisting and fighting back. And so that's why I call the book Yoga Anti-Colonial Philosophy. I'm not trying to make a special, I'm not trying to say, there's this kind of tangential relevance of decolonialism to yoga. It's basic. When we live life non-yogically and we internalize our experiences, we become agents of the political system we're in. And so we've been colonized, right? And so and this is a state of suffering and affliction. So when we devote ourselves to Ishvara, we change the kinds of choices we engage in. We start to practice a politics of solidarity with everybody who has an interest in independence. And it's a very different kind of moral life.
Yeah.
And that's what yoga is.
Devoting to Ishvara is devoting to one's own autonomy and sovereignty. Yeah.
Close. So Ishvara is an abstract ideal. It's not mine. It's just the ideal of sovereignty. So you are a person, as I am, because we have an interest in Ishvara, both of us. So it's the same ideal that explains our interest. Autonomy is something we generate by this devotional practice. So the Yoga Sutra is quite specific about that. Kaivalya is the word it uses for autonomy. That comes at the end of the practice. So you start with devotion to Ishvara, same Ishvara for all of us. We work on this practice and then we generate our own independence as a result of that devotional practice.
The question that I've been wanting to ask you, as I've heard you speak on all these podcasts about, this fourth idea about the right, devoting to what one sees as right, isn't it completely moral relativism then? That we can have
good question.
Right? Yeah.
Good question. Well, Ishvara is very clearly defined by Patanjali as having this freedom from the past and the freedom to move into the future. So insofar as we all engage in this devotional practice, it's the same ideal, right? So there's no relativism there. The practice does, because we're interested in sovereignty, makes room for each of us to choose our own values. So that's an important part of Swadhyaya. But we're doing it as part of a practice of taking our power back, right? When I choose what's important to me and I realize I'm giving power to that value, right? It doesn't have any independent sway over me. It's because I'm choosing it. So I'm taking my power back from the things that I am deeming as important, which means I could also revise, I could reconsider. Now, that is in a way relative what we as individuals are going to choose as important. But that's relative insofar as we have to make kind of personal choices for ourselves. But it all functions within this more general practice that we would be the same for everybody. And also, right, insofar as we're engaged in this devotion to Ishvara, there are some choices that would just be like off, some values that we just simply couldn't endorse, right? Because it would come in conflict with this devotion to Ishvara. So, the values that of like, prejudice or bigotry or that clutter my appreciation of what sovereignty is, right? The less abstract and the more I think about it in terms of my group or the people who look like me, the less I'm devoted to Ishvara and the more I'm devoted to just some description of the way the world is. And so that wouldn't be consistent with the practice, right? So even even though there's room for some personal choice, it's going to be limited within the practice.
Mm-mm. I think it's kind of devoting to clarity, really, then, isn't it? Or as you would frame it in the book, kind of the kind of exploring a proposition, or rather than interpreting one's own interpretation, rather than kind of a more philosophical kind of looking on, trying to work out more clearly using logic-based arguments. But
yeah, that's the meta ethic. So that's the background methodological choice we have to make. But then what yoga is saying is that when we're doing that, we should appreciate we are engaged in devotion to Ishvara because we're allowing ourselves to explore what it is to be sovereign. We're challenging ourselves to get over our prejudices and hang-ups. And then we're also leaving room for ourselves to make our own decisions about what's important to us.
Yeah. Would it help to define it between the ideas between the right and the good? You mentioned the book, and I think that makes it clear for people the difference between the right and the good. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So the right has to do with choices.
Yeah.
And courses of action, but basically choices and reasons. And then the good has to do with outcomes, things in the world that we could either value or disvalue. So, when I'm trying to figure out, what there is to value in the world, maybe happiness is a good thing, but happiness isn't really, it's not something I can do. I can rather do things that can bring about that outcome of happiness, right? So it's important, but it's not itself an action, a karma, so to speak. But there are other things that are really choices about what to do, right? So am I going to spend my time, working out what it is to be sovereign, or am I just going to pursue happiness, right? Now, if I decide I'm going to pursue happiness, I've decided that the outcome of happiness is a good that's going to center my action. If I go yogically, I don't think of outcomes as centering my action. I think about choosing and acting as the basic challenge. And then I don't worry about outcomes will kind of take care of themselves. Krishna says this in his discourse on yoga. Don't worry about the outcomes. Just kind of focus on what you need to do. That's a very core idea in yoga. And so every ethical theory is going to have some story about right choosing and doing, and then some story about good outcomes that we should value. The real question is, how do they relate, and what takes priority, right? And so yoga is radically procedural. It just don't worry about outcomes. Just really focus on the choosing and the doing.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to avoid complication, but we have kind of got things quite involved here. I fear, but I mean, what I wanted to say about Shyam's book here is that he does go through the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita in the chapters, and they are very, very different interpretations of what most people will generally understood about them. So they're super interesting for people. And this is a very different interpretation of especially the Yoga Sutras. There's the dearly beloved text of yoga students that you do come and interpret it very differently, and particularly things like tapas. I thought that was a very interesting one, and how you use the word tapas as unconservatism. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'd start off by saying the reason that my rendering of these topics is different is that I'm not interpreting. So I make a conscious choice to explicate, which is just a very different methodology. When we interpret, we're really just using what our expectations as the filter. When we allow ourselves to just follow the logic of the argument, we learn things, weird things we discover, right? And so it would be kind of surprising. I think this is the thing. It should be surprising to you if when you read the Yoga Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita, it says what you already believe. That should strike you as super weird, right? Because what are the chances of that? Something from 2,000 years ago, another culture just says exactly what you believe today, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's weirder, that people think that that's the norm. And then when you explicate, it's like, whoa, what's this Ranganathan doing? I'm like, no, you should be surprised if it just fits. We are here to learn. So I just focus on things like definitions, arguments, reasons, and tapas itself is a metaphor. It literally means heat production, right? But it's also one of the core practices of yoga as a kriya. And so as an explicator, I want to look at the reasons and the arguments in the Yoga Sutra that would shed light on that definition of yoga as a practice. So then I just go back to earlier. So all I did was I just went back to the earlier definition of Ishvara in book 1, and there is kind of these a bunch of the Ishvara is described with various traits, but it kind of falls into these two groups. This freedom from the baggage, so even the consequences of past choices, you're really allowing yourself. It says you're untouched by Ishvara is untouched by karma action, right? Which means that there's a way in which its own activity doesn't bind or constrain it. Now, what's a quick word to describe that? Well, on conservatism, right? Your own past choices and activities don't constrain what you are capable or willing to do now. When you go to look at yoga defined as a kriya, what potentially he's doing there, he's just setting out as practices what he's described as these essential traits. When we are generating heat, we're allowing ourselves to do something challenging. Why is it challenging? It's not really something we're used to doing, right? If it was something you used to, then there's no challenge. It's just ordinary, right? So even kind of unpacking the idea of tapas, so something that gets the sweat going, that gets the heat produced, right? What you have there is this, like, you have to ask the question of why, how, what makes for this to be something that creates the heat. And you can't get that answer without thinking, well, you're kind of really challenging yourself to do something a little uncomfortable, not normal.
And basically to resist interpreting things from your past perspectives, really, isn't
Yeah,
it? So I mean, the interpretation
absolutely.
and the
For
unconservatism go
sure.
together. Yeah,
Yeah,
resisting
absolutely.
interpretation. Yeah. Which is also to kind of to go into your idea of the clashes and the trauma based stuff, which I thought was another interesting point, that you're trying to resisting kind of getting sucked into your own kind of past experiences, right? Yeah,
right, for sure. Yeah, because what happens is that we live in our own prison. When we're not practicing yoga, we create this little identity for ourselves based on our experiences, and then we defend that. And that's our experiences aren't really up to us. Like, what I see, what I experience is a result of lots of people's choices, and maybe not things that are good for me. But if I internalize that, I create this prison where I then want to defend that and use my energy towards normalizing that. And the result is I live in this kind of self-imposed trauma where I'm literally haunted by my past. And that's why devotion to Ishvara is so important, because it just allows us to direct our energy in a different direction, right? Instead of, in a way, turning inward and dealing with all of our baggage, we don't allow ourselves to maintain that. Like, we maintain that by putting energy into it. We put energy into it by these experiences of ourselves in terms of this trauma. So the more we can just put our energy into something else, the more we can create different kinds of experiences for ourselves that then shift our understanding of ourselves too.
I think what you said somewhere else is that all yoga is really trauma based yoga, right?
Oh, this whole trauma based thing is it's funny, because it comes from this idea that you need to inform or ameliorate. Like, there's trauma-based, like, physiotherapy, and trauma-based firefighting, right? Like, there's no end to trauma-based. And so people just applied that to yoga. And when you see what they're doing, they're treating ordinary asana practices, the paradigm of what yoga is. And then they're observing, well, for some people, they can't do this because of trauma. But that way of looking at yoga is confused, because yoga isn't this ableist capacity to do some posture, and then if you can't do that, you have trauma. Yoga is a more basic devotional practice, right? We're all dealing with our own trauma. Like the reality is, there's no one with trauma, and then there are others without. Like we all have our stuff to deal with, and there's no way to get an understanding of yoga off the ground without appreciating what it says about trauma, which is, it says that, Book 2, Sutra 3, that we generate klesha, affliction, its way of talking about trauma, by ignorance. So when we identify with their experiences, we create this false sense of self, asmita, and then that creates a kind of personal prison where we're then limited by our past experiences, and then we get scared to do something new, to do something different, because we feel like we are departing from our safe zone, right? Whereas that safe zone was constructed out of all sorts of things that wasn't necessarily good for us in the first place. So, understanding what yoga is that, well, yoga should inform your trauma. You should bring your yoga practice to enlighten your kleshas, not the other way around. Not like, oh, I have a yoga practice. Oh, by the way, there's this thing, trauma, that I wasn't aware of. Well, if you weren't thinking about kleshas, in a way, you weren't really fully getting the full yoga practice going, right?
Yeah. I like that one. I mean, and it kind of ties in with the idea of not being a wallflower as well. I think
Yes.
the idea that you could get sucked into, oh, this is my trauma, and I'm going through this process we hear all the time, and I'm dealing with all this stuff. And
Oh
it's
my
like, well,
God.
actually, your
Oh,
idea in the book is very, very active, very dynamic about
yeah,
yoga. It's it's a very much a lived philosophy, right?
for sure. I mean, I think, I remember I had a student who had a very traumatic experience in her life around yoga, and it was very difficult for her. And then as she was and she would bring it up quite frequently. And then as she was taking the yoga philosophy courses with me, one day she was just like, it's no longer a thing. Like, it just stopped being a thing. And partly why it was a thing was that she wasn't allowing herself to really kind of put her energy into something else, which is kind of the broader practice. And this is why the philosophy is so important. If you don't have clarity over what you're doing, then you can waste your energy, accomplishing nothing really of importance to you. Like, you can tell yourself you were able to do this posture, that posture, but your life will be exactly the same in every other way, right? When we have the clarity that's brought by the philosophical practice, we're then able to make responsible choices in our practice in a way that are far more liberating, right? And so, you're right. It's when we're actually doing the original yoga practice, it's a basic life practice. It's not, it's not something I do between 9 and 10 and then something else afterward. And that's why it helps us get over our kleshas and trauma, because we don't ever give ourselves a break from this practice.
I mean, we've talked a fair bit about the philosophy of it, but and you've mentioned the asana a number of times, and of course that's the elephant in the room, yoga asana being the sum total of yoga altogether, right? And you mentioned yoga with a big Y, and yoga, many types. And it's not just yoga asana. Many people do different things, as you all point out in the book. You've got all your kind of kirtan and all that kind of stuff, and then you've got the asana, and you've got other things known as yoga, and you talk about them as a small Y. It's an obvious question, but in your opinion, how do the two dovetail together? The big Y yoga and the small Y yogas.
Yeah, so the big Y yoga is the devotion to Ishvara, and then you practice that devotion by the tapas and the swadhyaya. That's the yoga as a kriya. So the reason that's the big Y yoga is that if we understand that that's the big Y yoga, then we have a way to understand how all these other things can be ways to practice yoga. So then it just helps us move past. I mean, the philological approach is that, oh, look at the word yoga; it's used for so many different things, and then somehow every time we pick up we go from asana, now we're looking at pranayama, so like all of a sudden it's a new thing, right? Or then we look at this. We look at Ashtanga yoga, and then there's our Iyengar yoga, and then and people multiply this story about yogas, and it's not that you can't. You surely can if that's what you want to do. But what you're going to lack is an explanation for why did anybody ever think that these were all yogas, right? What's the logic So I think if you have a grounding in the philosophy of yoga, then you have a way to understand how all these practices, even if they seem peripheral, like mindfulness exercise and stuff like that, can be ways to practice yoga. Um, but then it's also completely possible to detach these small Y yoga practices from the practice of yoga. People did that, for instance, if they took up an alternate moral practice, like say Buddhism or Jainism, they would use these things, these small Y yogas, but for different ends. We can do these things. There's nothing, it's not impossible. But as someone who, studies yoga, I think, well, when you understand how awesome yoga is, you want that to be your you want to be freeing yourself and creating a space for yourself and others to do this kind of activity. So I think that's why the clarity on the big Y yoga is so important.
Mm. You mentioned a metaphor like a fruit salad or something like that, and all the fruits are part of the salad, but the salad isn't part of the salad.
Yeah, I have used that
Other way
metaphor
around.
for Hinduism, but you could use it for this too, right?
Yeah.
Hinduism is this big category for all things South Asian, so it's like fruit salad, right? Fruit salad is a collection of different pieces of fruit. It's not like when you pick out a piece of fruit salad, you've got fruit salad, right? It could just be a grape or a pear. It's not a collection of different pieces of fruit, but you put it back together, fruit salad. And Hinduism's like that. People think it's this thing. I was like, well, it's a thing when you put it all together. You could take it apart. I think the case of yoga is a little different because when we're actually practicing small Y yoga, there's a way in which, as long as we're like deliberately doing it as a yoga practice, understanding fully what that means.
It is the whole. It is the whole.
We are actually getting the full thing, right? It's not a completely, but part of it is marketing. People like to market something new, right? And then have like this new version of doing it. It's very different from something else.
Yeah. And people are going to ask, well, how do I do that? People
have all sorts of weird agendas too.
Yeah. Sorry, Shyam, I just wanted to say that on the back of the end of the book is a very clear and more practical exploration of how one might do big Y yoga in small Y yoga classes, as it were.
Yeah.
So that's important because people say, well, how do I make sure, especially as a white Western person, how do I make sure that I'm doing justice to this and not just simply reappropriating my own ideas about whatever and putting them onto yoga, so there is that more practical exploration on the back of the book, and so how you might incorporate these ideas into asana classes and make sure that they are done with integrity and it can be done right. Not to say, you can't teach asana because that's not yoga. I mean, I think you're very much saying, well, you can't. It is. It's just a question of how you go about it.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly right. So I say that when you're teaching yoga, you are really sharing your yoga practice with your students. So if you're not clear about what your yoga practice is, you're not going to be able to share it, right? So it really starts with the teacher and their clarity about what they're doing. And it's really simple. It's just this idea that, yoga is this devotion to Ishvara, and then we're going to practice that with our own tapas and svadhyaya. And so now we'll just take the opportunity to do that while we explore X, Y, and Z, right? It's very simple, but it requires a kind of clarity and deliberation.
Yeah, and some personal responsibility to reflect about what one's doing.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think to finish off, you mentioned yoga as devotion a number of times. I think people would like to know a little bit more about that. And I wonder maybe if you could contrast that idea to make it more clear for people with, say, what Advaita Vedanta is or what Buddhism is. Because often you walk into yoga studios these days, another kind of slight frustration of mine is, it's a yoga studio and you see there's Buddhas everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's a confusion of different philosophical stances or perspectives.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Bhakti, devotion, and yoga are the same theory because yoga at base is this practice of devotion to Ishvara, and that's what Bhakti is. People get confused for several reasons. I think when we interpret, given the Western tradition, we want to understand Bhakti as some version of theism, like devotion to God. But that's a different theory where God is this good thing that tells us what to do. Ishvara is the ideal of the right, And so in being devoted to it, we're taking the responsibility to figure things out ourselves. So it's very different. It's the opposite of being a follower, right? Being devoted to Ishvara is actually like you're stepping up your game to really be the source of your own practice, right? Not to be a follower. And I think that's what the Bhakti tradition too, people took on the responsibility of emulating, the characteristics of Ishvara in their life. And that's an important part of the practice. I also point out, I mean, if you're interested in the full decolonization, I talk about this. The deities were just non-linguistic ways to talk about these basic moral ideals. So Ishvara Pranidhana is Adisesha, Vishnu is Tapas, Lakshmi is Swadhyaya, and they float over that ocean of the Chittavrittis. It's there graphically. And so when Vishnu shows up in all of these junctions to talk about, he's either mentioned in the earliest account of yoga in the Upanishads with the Katha Upanishad, where death is teaching to Nachiketa. He says when you practice yoga, you end up in the realm of Vishnu. Or in the Gita, you have Vishnu delivering lectures on yoga. These things aren't arbitrary. They're kind of explorations of these philosophy. And so when we look at Bhakti there too, you can see that they were working with the same ideas. Buddhism is a version of consequentialism that says that there's an outcome that we should be achieving, which is the reduction of suffering. And so then anything we do that gets us there is the right thing to do. And then there are all sorts of kind of tweaks and modifications. As the tradition goes along, it turns into Mahayana tradition where it's a reduction of everyone, like the emphasis on everyone's suffering. And then there are also other kinds of changes that happen too. Thinking that suffering is the problem is just a different moral frame, right? For the devotee, the problem isn't my suffering. The problem is my lack of autonomy, right? And I suffer because I'm not autonomous. But suffering's just a symptom. It's not the problem. I can be devoted. I can put energy into reducing my suffering, but also sacrifice my autonomy. All sorts of ways to do that. Join a cult, or start doing drugs.
Yeah.
Or, there are all sorts of ways that I can just reduce my suffering without dealing with the more basic question of autonomous agency and responsibility. So when we're worried in yoga, it's not that you're not worried. It's not that you want to suffer, but if you make that the priority, your energy goes in the wrong way, right? Like, well, how is it that people just start taking more and more pills? They start taking a pill because they have a pain, and then they have to take more pills because then their body gets used to it. And before you know it, there's not enough pills in the world for that pain. Very normal thing that happens to people. And, that's just a metaphor for what happens when we focus on suffering. That instead of improving, we can have all sorts of other problems show up. So, I think that's one huge difference. When you're concerned about devotion to Ishvara and sovereignty, it's far more political because you understand what it is to be a person in terms of your interests in autonomy. And then you think this is what we all share. So I can't, for instance, be silent on issues of justice and public safety. I have to take a stand on all these things, right? So in yoga, fighting the war, sometimes you just have to stand up and fight the good fight. There's no way around it. If you're worried about suffering, you might want to avoid fighting because that's a pretty painful thing to do. In fact, Arjuna, as one of his reasons as to why he shouldn't fight, he's like, oh, it's going to be pretty horrible. People will suffer, right? So there are forks in the road that you, depending upon which is your moral practice, you will go down. So I think people who are taking a stand on issues of justice, for all, non-human animals, the earth, other people and other cultures, that's all yoga. That's firmly within yoga. If you're just worried about suffering reduction, you might not want to bring that up because it's kind of, it makes people upset. Mm-hmm. So that, it can be kind of, it's not just a choice. There are real political differences.
Well, I think that we've more or less covered quite a lot of the ground of the excellent book that I've just finished reading. Look, listen, listeners, it isn't that complicated, honestly. If you read the book, we've summarized a lot of it in very basic, broad strokes. Read the book, and you'll find it a lot more less complicated. If you found this difficult, and it explains it with Dr. Ranganathan will explain it in the book in simple terms that you will fully understand. Don't worry about that. But it's whet your appetite, I hope, for what is a very different perspective. If you want to have a different perspective on your yoga, whether you agree with it or not, it doesn't really matter. But a different perspective, then look no further. This is the best thing I've read for ages, and well, I do read quite a lot. So thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
so much for
Ranganathan.
having me.
It's been so cool to speak to you again and ask some of those questions that I wanted to ask you personally. Yeah, thanks for taking the time, And we'll put the link to the newest work and read the older books as well. They're all good in the show notes. So thanks again. It's been great.
Thank you so much.